The next segment, and this is a trifecta this morning, so this is the second out of three, is Pannenberg from, formerly from the World Bank. Um, the World Bank thinking has been really important to us as we began to think about this. And we thought it'd be valuable to have a perspective on what we've done so far from that. And we've given him editorial license to comment freely, but only in 20 minutes. So
All right. So also this works like this, right? Yeah. So thank you very much, Warren, and thank you very much all for a wonderful discussion that I enjoyed over the last 2 days. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here all the time because, as some of you may know, yesterday the IMF and the World Bank annual meeting started here, and you asked me to give you some comments not too long ago. So it's some, but actually there is some interaction here that I will share with you. In the first place, I won't share with you abstractions or theories or models. I've listened, and you asked me, as you just said, Warren, to kind of ad lib, give some responses. And some of them, very simplistically, I've put here on some windows. And I have 25 windows. I will skip through some of them because of time. But the first one is natural for all of us to have some kind of tunnel vision. And with due respect to all of you and all of us, the last 2 days was big on display in that respect. We all live in our own world, our own profession, and we tend to look inward. The first thing that struck me was the imbalance between our discussions of what we know and are good at within our own profession. And only very few of us yesterday and today stepped out of our profession and said, okay, I know about my own stuff, but I want to hear about the stuff that I do not know about. So in this thing, most of the discussions, even today, was about the model. Very nice. I think the model is great, actually. But it was mostly about the labor market. I heard very little about financing. Time and again, it says on the very top financing, but then all the discussions are about supply and mismatch and demand and needs and so on. The financing was kind of absent. Whereas you may wish to change the title to labor market, or as you just said this morning, to economics, that's fine. But right? So that's the first one. The second one is, I would urge you to make a distinction when you look at academic world, step out of our, and I'm part of you in that respect, our health world. Increasingly, the academic world tilts horizontally. So look at the other departments, outside nursing departments, outside the laboratory, outside the internal medicine, etc. Look at medical physics, look at health economics, look at the transport, the trauma people, including we work with engineers in transport, etc., etc. So that's an element that I think, especially in terms of financial flows, the investors in accelerators in physics are fundamentally different financial people than invest in medical schools. But you have to work in the future with them. We're talking about also the future of financing. So it's not like the past. The next window is, I'll skip this one. We've discussed that quite often. Now, the private sector. Edson has highlighted it, but take it into account more than so far you've done. It's going to grow dramatically. I don't know how many of you are aware, for example, of the Laureate Education Corporation. They're growing dramatically, much more than exponential. So public funding is going to reduce in the future. Private funding is going to enlarge in terms of financing. And therefore, the private sector in terms of health and medical education will become much, much larger, which then has all kinds of implications for quality and accreditation. Make a distinction between private sector and public sector in terms of ownership and financing. Originally, as you can hear from my accent, I'm from the Netherlands. There's not a single, despite what you may think, medical school in the Netherlands or university in the Netherlands that is public. All universities in the Netherlands are private. They are not government owned. But then 98% of their funding comes from public money. That creates a whole special kind of dynamic. So nobody in academia in the Netherlands is a civil servant. They're all private employees and employers. But the public money finances it. So you have public financing models and private execution. So there's a contracting thing going on, which plays a main role in terms of financing. Traditional sources, I'll skip this one. This is something that you should fully be aware of. We all kind of assume that the public money and that governments will step up to the plate to provide additional resources, public resources, for all the health professionals that the world will need. Well, with due respect, from a financial point of view and a macroeconomic point of view and a global point of view, what you see there at the bottom came out yesterday at the IMF annual meeting. The world is $152 trillion in debt. That's 200% of the global economy. That's going to revisit us in the next 5 years. It means that governments will have no money. It's very simple. Right? So the assumption that governments will be able to finance all the additional health professionals that Edson highlighted, the 15 million or the 20 million that are necessary in the next 15 years, is an illusion. It's an absolute illusion. So you, in terms of financing, you have to step out of our all us being kind of in the public sector or on the socialist side, and I can say that being from the Netherlands. The Netherlands, the World Bank in 1992 had a little conversation that the Soviet Union had imploded, and now, okay, so we had one, and there were no communist countries anymore, and then a colleague of mine said, no, we still have China and Vietnam and Cuba and North Korea and the Netherlands. And so I'm with you, but it's very clear the public financing will be very, very constrained. Now, the public financing will be constrained, and how you look at this from a private sector financing point of a public sector point of view is colored by ideology. And not many of the discussions have been open about it. I urge you to be much more open about it. Some of you here, we had a talk yesterday about it, you will remember the 1980s Geminex studies. The Geminex studies were a massive undertaking. We had these 25 or 35 yellow books on the table. They went to Congress, and Congress killed it. This was 1988. Why? They killed it because they said, this is Soviet planning. You're planning to have, by the year 2010, another 11,000 surgeons. That's Soviet planning. The market will take care of that. That's exactly the mandate of this group. We're looking at labor markets. The market would take care of it. It took almost 30 years to be back at the level now where we are, where governments have HRH departments. In the wake of the Geminex failure, WHO abolished its health manpower department. It was away for 20 years. It took 20 years to come back. Many ministries of health in the world abolished their HRH departments. It took 20 years to come back. So the ideology is important to recognize and be important and be open about, in my view. Now, nothing much has been said, at least not while I was here, about the involvement of ministries of finance. You have to do that. In the future, if you want to safeguard at least some of the public financing for health professional education, make sure you engage directly with your Ministry of Finance people, right? It's very important. And these ministries of finance, they are completely different individuals than all of us. I worked when I retired from the bank. There's still mandatory retirement. We do age discrimination at the World Bank and the IMF. So it was, it was very clear that it was kind of in their world that the link between health professionals or agriculture professionals, etc., and the finance people, the whole thinking models are fundamentally different. So you need to build, as a community of academicians and interested in health professional financing, health professional education, you need to build translators, if you like, with ministries of finance. And ministers of finance, the moment you would go to them and say, look, we need additional resources, etc., for health professional education, this is the fiscal space diamond from Peter Heller from the IMF from 10 years ago, and is generally used for financing for governments. But you can adapt it for our subject. And what will a Minister of Finance, where will he put his finger? Immediately here to the left. He will immediately turn the question around and say to you, well, I'm not going to give you either allow you to go for deficit financing or get more revenue or government public funds. You better clean up your own act, because efficiency in health and medical schools and teaching hospitals is a disaster. Come back when you've done that. That will be there. So it's good to keep this in mind. This is an element that I'd like to share with you. It plays a role here, and it plays, but increasingly around the world, the distinction between financing and the money that is available in the research world, and it can be big, can be billions of dollars, and the teaching and education and training world are too dichotomized sometimes. In Africa and Asia, there are now big scientific institutions that have no academic affiliation. None of these bright people who do all the research in our fields are teaching. They're not training anyone. That's not good. See? So this, from a financing point of view, when you can get the money through research, as was mentioned yesterday, you have to much more, I suggest, link that explicitly. This we have talked extensively about. I will skip this as well. Now, this is also something from a financial point of view, an investment point of view, that you may wish to be arguing along more specifically. Production of health professionals is not your normal product. It's a long-term capital product. Nobody invests in Boeing or Airbus or in Bombardier for trains or in the TGV on a regular investment basis. Nobody does that on a quarterly return investment basis. Everybody does that in a special way for long-term capital goods. Medical schools, academic health centers for professional training are long-term capital goods. So position your institution in that world, not in the quarterly return world, which all financiers immediately will push you into. Now, this is practical. So when financial investments, there was some, as I said earlier, somewhat of an assumption that the money will come from the public sectors. I urge you to step beyond that and look at the investment world. And when you look at the investment world, become specific. It's very nice that you expanded your list of actors to say, well, financing from governments and private sector and insurance companies. It's way too generic for my taste. It's almost as if you're kind of sidestepping the issue. You have to be specific, right? The biggest financial actors in the health universe are insurance companies. It's not even governments, right? So insurance companies, and they're big ones. So like Allianz Global, the Global Investment Department of Allianz, AXA, Prudential, the pension funds, they're actually currently looking for investment opportunities. As you know, the interest rates are so low that even pension funds have to expand into non-traditional sectors because they don't have a return anymore. So this is an area where I urge you to at least look at in the future. This is another element that occurred to me when also in previous discussions, there's somewhat of an assumption, and this morning there was a mention of it. We created a new academic health center here. We created a new medical school here. Maybe this country needs one other veterinary school. The whole investment and financial thinking of our senior managers in this field is a one-off thinking. So a country has 12 medical schools or 168 medical schools. And then they say, well, you know, we have a shortage here, or we need more of that, or we need to change the curriculum there. Let's add one here in the state of Arizona or in Massachusetts. Says, maybe we can have one more teaching hospital. There are no strategies. There are no comprehensive investment strategies. Yeah. See? So that's an area where you may wish to go. This is an area that you may wish to look at, bond issues, the issuing of bond. The Vanderbilt University Medical Center issued a bond of $530 million, just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude. It was underwritten by the public sector, but this is going increasingly into the private sector. Here you have a couple of areas how potentially you have investors and financiers for education, for training of health professionals. All of these are interested in engaging financially with our world. And the example of Sanofi in Algeria is a nice one and a useful one. Sanofi had a shortage of pharmacological scientists. To create a pharmacological scientist in France is expensive. To create them in Algeria is less than half the price. Sanofi is now financing the Department of Pharmacology to the tune of 60% of the University of Algiers. Now, it may pose questions in terms of academic independence and blah, 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 but from a financial point of view, the University of Algiers benefited tremendously from this model. Here you have the 10 largest banks in the world. Every single one of them has a department of health sector investment. So it needs to be part of our thinking. Global campuses, I'll skip this. Vertical, yeah, okay, we don't have time for this. Yeah, this is regulations versus monopoly. This one, Edson reminded me of when Tony Blair became, for the first time, Prime Minister of the UK, and he commented on a couple of things, and then he mentioned there are two constituencies that I will never touch: the Church of England and the British Medical Association. Right? Now, that's this. Essentially, you're talking about a labor market where the inflow is regulated. Essentially, the power has been delegated by Parliament to the profession, so the profession controls itself. It's almost essentially corrupt. They control, and it's logical. In economics, you control how many people come into your profession, so my income is high. It's very simplistic. So in terms of labor market, it means you have to open up the market. The market is closed. So you can talk all you want how to change curricula and this and that and shortages. It won't happen until you break open the profession. Now it's happening on the sides, left here and there, and globally, of course, it will happen. But it's something that, in my view, one may wish to be more open about. Yeah, this is an important element. It was mentioned yesterday, but just for 1 minute, we all tend to be in the health universe. If you really want to look at financing for health professional education, engage the education universe, including ministries of education, departments of education, the whole education investment world. They're education people. They don't know about health. And health quite often is actually excluded. When the World Bank makes investments in universities, it's very interesting. We had 36 investments in universities around the world, and 34 of them financed everything in the university with the exception of the medical school. Because the medical school is almost always, together with the teaching hospital, is the largest expense element of a university. An occasional technical university with a physics accelerators accepted. But so it's too complicated also, because the financial flows between the teaching, who subsidizes who and who has the power, so you simply exclude it. You say, we'll finance the whole university, we invest in it, but we leave those out. Now that's the education people. The education people have to be brought in their own right. So this is the power structures. You're aware of that. Some teaching hospitals have more power than the medical schools. In some countries, the medical schools have more. That investors don't like that insecurity. You have to be explicit about it. Who has the power here? Who has the power to decide over the money and the expenses and the future investments? So that needs to be more upfront. Profit margins, same way. We tend to say, in line with what I said earlier, we tend to be fuzzy about profit margins. It's much better to be open about it in the future. This is an area where internationally, the health and education together again. This also. This is in the private sector again. One of you this morning mentioned it in staffing and manpower organizations. You know, Adecco and Randstad are by far the largest purely private sector companies running health professionals. Much larger than any medical school, any health sector in a state or small countries, etc. Right? Adecco has a turnover of, this year, they made a big jump of $35 billion. Randstad the same. See? So you need to engage with these people. These are your demand people. They're in between in your labor market. And just to ignore them won't help you. Consolidation, health insurance. I mentioned health insurance earlier. The health insurance companies around the world, there were hundreds and hundreds of them. They have consolidated tremendously. So I would say also in health professional education, there are way too many individual, independent medical schools, nursing schools. In the future, in the next 30 years, you will, in many countries, you will see enormous consolidation, which is, for a financing point of view, good, because you have one larger corporation that you can deal with. But this is then my final slide, the public-private partnerships, because as you saw, in a way, I said, okay, take into account much more closely the private sector and the financiers and all the different, even venture capital and capital managers like BlackRock and Blackstone, etc. But in many countries, it is not too realistic yet because there's not enough money. So the more realistic way is to build these public-private partnerships between governments and private sector players and the profession itself and where you want to get the money. So my main suggestion, therefore, is be inclusive and bring all these other people in. Bring these financial people in. None of us here in the room is probably a vice president of accounting. Right? You need those. You need people who know the investment world. You need the people who know the returns of investment in that field. So include them ultimately in the decision making. So one of your famous television hosts normally says good night and good luck. I say good day and good luck.